The Soviet Union, and later its internationally recognized successor state, the Russian Federation, have long prided themselves on their tank forces. Russia has the world's largest armada of tanks, with a total of 12,566 units in its fleet. This is a number greater than the combined total of North Korea, 6,645, and the United States, 5,500, which come in at second and third place, respectively. So with all this pride about its supposed tank prowess, why has it been so reluctant to deploy its latest and greatest tanks to the battlefields in Ukraine? We all know about Russia's refusal to deploy its few T-14 Armata tanks into battle in Ukraine. It's afraid of losing them. However, Russia has also been hesitant to send its T-90s into combat too, and it's deployed comparatively few of them in Ukraine. Why? Is the T-90 also a tank that doesn't live up to the stories that the Russians have told about it? Or was the T-90 a marketing gimmick all along? Let's take a look at the T-90, Russia's supposedly most advanced main battle tank that it possesses in large numbers, and its less than stellar performance in combat. Russia's fleet of over 12,500 tanks is, like many things related to its military, deceptive. Of these, only about 2,600 of them are main battle tanks, and of these 2,600, only about 650, 25% of them, are T-72B3 B3M, T-80 BVM and T-90 AM models that are outfitted with modern fire control systems. According to the Pentagon, by the beginning of 2023, Russia had lost half of the tanks it deployed since its invasion of Ukraine, thanks to their outdated designs, the armored fleet's poor logistics and doctrine, and poor leadership. The T-72 tank remains the workhorse of the Russian military, and has been the most widely deployed Russian tank to Ukraine, rather than the newer T-90. The T-90 has instead played second fiddle to its predecessor, and with good reason. This supposed modern main battle tank's origins, the design flaw it inherently carries, and how it has performed in Ukraine scream failure. Let us explain. The T-90 saw its origins in the late Soviet Union, when the Western powers were producing tanks like the Abrams, Challenger 2, and Leopard 2. Soviet tank designers were worried about this development and wanted to produce a replacement for their entire tank fleet, one which could compete with the designs their rivals were now making. However, instead of taking a page out of the West's playbook and designing an entirely new tank, the Soviets based the T-90 on a fusion of the T-72 and the T-80. As it turns out, this may not have been the best choice. The Russian machine builder Uralvagonzavod produced and built the tank, which entered service in 1992, just after the Soviet Union's collapse. It has since been upgraded with the T-90A in 2004, the T-90M in 2016, and the T-90MS in 2017. Russia probably had between 750 and 1,000 of the T-90 and all its variants on hand prior to the invasion of Ukraine. So how was this tank originally designed? Let's start with the basics. The T-90 is operated by a crew of 3. The tank also has an integrated autoloader for its 125mm cannon and a low-profile design. Its secondary weapons are 12.7mm cord heavy machine gun and a 7.62mm PKMT belt-fed machine gun. The tank also boasts a Shatora curtain, an electrical jammer that deploys smoke grenades when a missile targets the tank. Infrared lights are also part of its defensive array, and these are designed to confuse the guidance system of an incoming tank-killing missile or rocket. The T-90 is built with reactive armor tiles, which are designed to explode when impacted by a tank-killing munition. This helps protect the tank from the full impact of an incoming round. Additionally, the T-90 is built with composite armor materials to make it more rugged against conventional ammunition and precision-guided anti-tank weapons. Unfortunately, these armor systems have often proven less than adequate, and when Russia is involved, you can expect corruption too. Just as we saw in the case of Russian body armor, corrupt officers have had a penchant to sell off the reactive armor panels of the T-90 and other tanks because they are valuable in their own right. To replace them, the officers have installed other materials. At first, rumors went around that they had just put egg cartons onto the tank's sides. This was an easy rumor to believe, given Russia's long history of incompetence that included protecting its soldiers with the airsoft version of the Ratnik body armor. In fact, the material in question is a plastic filler called the 4S24 Softcase Era Block. Unfortunately for Russia, this is not adequate protection against modern anti-tank rounds, even if they don't just fly over it like the Javelin does. Russia has tried to develop better defenses for its existing tanks. These attempts include the arena armor, which made some waves before the war in video demonstrations. In 2021, Russia released footage of the T-72B3 tank defending itself from an incoming RPG-7 rocket by launching an interceptor that destroyed the rocket in flight. The arena's active protection system was responsible for this and appeared to show promise for Russia as a way to further protect its tanks without overburdening them with heavier and heavier armor. The arena system rings the host tank with several millimeter wave radars pointed at different angles. If these radars detect an incoming threat, they will automatically launch an interceptor out of an armored silo located on the tank. Unfortunately for Russia, the arena system proved to be just another marketing campaign and could not be deployed. The arena system has not appeared in Ukraine at any point in the war. Operationally, the T-90 has a top road speed of 43 miles per hour and has an operational range of 310 miles. The tank weighs about 48 tons. The T-90's weight is about 20 tons less than its Western rivals. One would think this would be to its advantage. However, the additional weight of tanks like the Abrams Challenger 2 and Leopard 2 is usually put into their armor. This additional armor makes them more survivable, which is critical in a world of precision fire and where the first tank to get shot usually dies. Western tanks are simply better protected and more likely to withstand multiple hits, a fact which we've seen play out in Ukraine's campaign in Zaporizhia, where Russian weapons have often been unable to destroy them outright. Rather, these Western tanks have often been damaged in engagements with their crews surviving. They are then sent to the rear for repairs and put back in the fight. At the same time, Russian tanks, which are often exposed in an attempt to inflict disproportionate casualties on their enemy, get killed in the same engagement without adequately fulfilling the mission they were sacrificed for. Before the war in Ukraine, the T-90 had been a popular tank for international sales. International arms deliveries have been one of the few strong points in Russia's post-Soviet economy. Risking those relationships would be the last thing the Kremlin would want to do, which explains the T-90's comparative absence in Ukraine. The T-90's foreign users include Algeria, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Iraq, Vietnam, Syria, and above all, India, which has long had a close arms relationship with Russia and operates about 2,080 T-90 tanks. Unfortunately, performance in Ukraine is only one of the T-90's problems that questioned its prospects for further export abroad. India's experience with the T-90s has proven far from smooth. Indian T-90 tanks were spotted with the infamous cope cages near its border with Pakistan in the middle of October 2023, demonstrating that India is not entirely confident about the tank's defensive qualities, for good reason, because India has experience with faulty T-90s. For example, to fulfill one Indian order of T-90s, the Russian mounted older, less protective turrets to new hulls. Russia exported these turrets to its Indian customer anyway because it had pre-built a lot of them and didn't want to see them go to waste. These were, however, more vulnerable than newer turrets. The comparative lack of protection was not the only problem either. During tests, the Indians found that their new tanks' fire control systems and thermal imaging sites could not cope with their country's hot summer weather. To adapt the T-90 to this climate, Russian manufacturers offered to build specialized air conditioning systems for the tanks, but these also failed, and a tank driver fainted from heat stroke, which forced India to shop abroad to find ways to solve the problem. These and other issues have made India reconsider its tank relationship with Russia. As tensions between it and China mount, and Pakistan remains a constant threat, the last thing India wants is faulty tanks that would prove ineffective in combat. Indeed, the thermal sights on the T-90 for the tank's commanders have proven so bad that the Russians were secretly installing French sights. However, because of sanctions, these are no longer available. The new T-90s will come with the same Russian sights that proved so unsatisfactory in India. The T-90 compares poorly to Western main battle tanks partly because, as we said, it's basically just a variant of the older T-72, combined with some parts of the T-80, such as the Irtish fire control system, with reactive armor strapped to the chassis. The T-90 was also not designed with open architecture in mind, which means that it is a difficult tank to keep up to date with modern weapons and equipment. Case in point, the T-90's autoloader can't fire Russia's newer and larger anti-tank kinetic projectiles, the Vacuum 1 armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot. These rounds were designed for the T-14 Armata, but they cannot be reverse-engineered for the T-90 or older tanks. Unfortunately for the Russians, the T-14 has never materialized on the battlefields of Ukraine, so these new anti-tank rounds, which actually pose a threat to the Abrams, Challenger 2 and Leopard 2, have also been absent from the war. If you want to know why so many Western tanks have been damaged but not destroyed, while their Russian counterparts have gone down in flames, this is one of the reasons. Another of the most glaring problems is the T-90's short effective firing range. The tank's main gun is difficult to raise to high angles. The T-90's gun can move up to a range of 14 degrees upward or 6 degrees downward, which severely limits the targets it can hit. As an example, the T-72 and T-80 tanks deployed in Chechnya proved incapable of raising their guns high enough to shoot at rebels on rooftops or behind third-story windows. These rebels destroyed many Russian tanks with anti-tank weapons, while the T-72s and T-80s proved incapable of retaliation with their main guns. Because the T-90 was based on these two tanks, it suffers from the same problems, and it's proving just as bad in tank-v-tank combat in Ukraine. Western main battle tanks like the American Abrams can hit targets up to 3 miles away, aided by greater gun mobility. In contrast to Russian tanks, the Abrams can raise its turret to an upward angle of 20 degrees, or lower it to an angle of 9 degrees, giving it greater range and flexibility. The T-90 cannot do this, so it will lose out at longer range combat. The T-90 is also comparatively deficient in its ability to puncture the armor of opposing modern Western tanks. To safely do so, it will need to get closer to its targets, while enemy tanks can stay back at safer ranges. Obviously, this reality is not advantageous for the Russian tank. Poor doctrine was literally built into the T-90's design. One of the reasons the Soviet planners chose not to go with a completely new design for the T-90 was because they wanted the tank to remain cheap, which its predecessor, the T-72, also was. The T-72 was designed to replicate World War II-era flood tactics and overwhelm its opponents with mass. This design has carried over into the T-90, where it's been implemented in Ukraine to poor results. The tank's cost hints at this purpose, as one T-90 costs roughly between $2.5 million to $4.5 million, depending on the variant, which is much less expensive than its Western counterparts. By comparison, an Abrams tank can cost over $10 million per unit, while the Leopard 2 can cost $6 million and the Challenger 2 around $5 million. This comparison in unit costs reveals the Soviet plans to flood the zone with the sheer mass of T-90s they plan to produce. Unfortunately for the Russians, this mass of T-90s never came. Russia lost much of its tank-producing infrastructure in the chaos of the Soviet Union's collapse. The T-90 was notably absent in the First Chechen War. Instead, the T-72 and T-80 were sent into combat, where they performed poorly. By keeping the T-90 out of the fight in Chechnya, Russia was able to maintain the illusion that it was one of the world's best main battle tanks. The Kremlin went on a marketing spree, pretending there was no need to deploy one of the world's best tanks against poorly organized and equipped rebels in Chechnya. According to the Kremlin, the T-90 was above such trivialities. The marketing campaign worked because international sales of the T-90 picked up. When the T-90 did start to see combat, it performed far below the standards that Russia had made the world come to expect from it. Russia's intervention on behalf of Bashar al-Assad in the Syrian civil war quickly put the T-90 to the test. Just as quickly, footage spread on social media showing Syrian rebels destroying T-90 tanks with old Tau missiles. Bashar al-Assad's army received 30 T-90s from Russia. 5 or 6 of them were confirmed to be destroyed by wire-guided Tau-2A missiles between 2016 and 17. It was a preview of things to come in Ukraine. As early as May 2022, Ukrainian troops proved capable of killing the T-90 with a Carl Gustav recoilless rifle in Kharkiv Oblast. This was the first confirmed kill of a T-90 during the war. According to the Oryx blog, Russia has 2,458 visually confirmed tank losses since the war in Ukraine began. Of these, 90 are T-90 tanks. 34 of the losses are of the T-90A, 1 is a T-90AK, 7 are T-90S tanks, and 48 are T-90M tanks. This data is current as of November 5, 2023. One contributor to these losses is the fact that the T-90 comes with a design that stores its ammunition inside the tank compartment. Once the vehicle takes a direct hit, it and its crew will be blown sky high. Russian tank turrets getting sent skyward in explosions have been a common feature circulating on social media footage taken by Ukrainian soldiers. While most of these tanks have been T-72s, the T-90 is no exception and has met the same fate many times. In October 23, spectacular footage taken by a drone circulated showing a T-90 getting totaled by an anti-tank round in Ukraine. The way Russia has used its tanks has not done it any favors and has instead compounded their design flaws. Russia has repeatedly failed to coordinate its armor with its infantry and artillery, often moving armored columns independently of the other branches of its military. Russian tank crews also tend to be poorly trained. Because Russia has lost tanks at high rates with their crews getting killed in the process, Russian tankers tend to be inexperienced. However, even if Russia managed to find a way to fix these deficiencies, the fact is that its tanks are outdated and incapable of standing up to modern Western armor and anti-tank tactics or equipment. And because Russian tanks like the T-90 are obsolescent designs that are not adapted for open architecture, the Kremlin cannot upgrade its tank fleets like its Western rivals can. In particular, the inability for the T-90s and its older siblings to use the new Vacuum 1 round has put them behind the 8 ball when it comes to dealing with the modern tanks that Ukraine is now fielding. The lack of open architecture is especially bad news for a Russia that lacks the means to create an adequate replacement tank for its older vehicle, as seen in the failure of the T-14 Armata program. After a decade, only a handful have been built, and sanctions mean that it will be challenging for Russia to get the parts it needs to build more of them. As the T-90 and its older siblings get depleted, Russia has been forced to rely on even older designs like the T-62 and T-54-55. With the steady losses of T-90s, T-80s and T-72s, Russia's tank force has gotten proportionally more outdated, while Ukraine's has gotten proportionally more modern thanks to the aid of its Western allies. Perhaps this is one of the reasons that the Russians seem to have surged the T-90 into combat in recent weeks. T-90 losses have accelerated as Ukraine gains more ground in Zaporizhia, which may demonstrate that Russia has more T-90 tanks on hand and is no longer willing to hold them back from action. Russian factories seem to be producing more T-90s. However, these are still, by their nature, obsolescent designs, and for Russia there seems to be no way out of this conundrum. Even though Ukraine still mostly uses the older, Soviet-era tanks, its arsenal steadily gets more advanced. Germany has announced it will deliver 14 more Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine in early 2024 to replace some of the units Ukraine has lost in recent weeks of fighting in its Zaporizhia offensive. Russia, meanwhile, has no choice but to continue depleting its arsenal and hope that it will be able to bleed more than its enemy will. For all the talk about how advanced it is, the T-90 is merely the latest expression of Russia's traditional way of war, using sheer mass to take more punishment than the enemy can until exhaustion sets in. That was, after all, what the T-90 was designed to do, despite Russia's pretensions to the contrary when selling the tank abroad. The T-90 is far from one of the world's premier main battle tanks. It is instead set into a fixed, obsolete pattern, unable to adapt to the modern battlefield and ineffective against even armed rebels with adequate anti-tank equipment, let alone organized Western armies with top-of-the-line equipment. Russia may be able to win through attrition in Ukraine using these tanks as part of the program, but it will come at a high price for little gain, and the loss of much of its effective land power. The tank fleet has long been Russia's pride and joy, but in Ukraine, it's getting beaten at its own game, and will emerge with far less capability than it had before the invasion began. The T-90 had a lot of hype going into the conflict, but that was all. In the war's aftermath, no matter how it ends up, Russia will have far fewer main battle tanks to call on in any future conflict or to present an effective land deterrent. But what do you think about the T-90 and its results in Ukraine? Is there anything that Russia could have or still can do differently? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button for more military analysis from military experts.